Good morning, everyone. Or sorry, good afternoon, I should say. It is now 12 o'clock. My name is Chay. I am the Director of Communications at the School of Public Affairs at American University. And I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for our discussion, our progressives, and actually other groups within the electorate finding path to electoral victory this fall. I'm joined today by William Sweeney, who is the former executive director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He was a deputy chair of the DNC. Most importantly to us, he was a SPA executive in residence, working at the key programs. He is also an SPA grad, an Eagle, a proud Eagle, SPA class of 73, and has worked for many years in Washington politics and in business, most notably as the CEO of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Bill, I wanted to take some time to talk to you today because we've seen energy through the primary season, some of which may be dissipating if their chosen candidates aren't making their way through the electoral process. I know I'm thinking of Bernie Sanders voters and Elizabeth Warren voters, and as we saw in New York and Kentucky last week, there was a lot of energy around some progressive candidates, some of whom made it through. Others, as in most notably in Kentucky with Charles Booker, did not. And I wanted to get your thoughts about what that means for the fall, and especially considering that we are in a very different electoral season. It's a transformative time, as you've mentioned in the past, and with COVID complicating issues in terms of in-person voting. What does this mean? So I'm going to toss it to you to just give me your thoughts initially, and then we are happy to take. We're streaming live on Facebook. Please leave your questions in the comments, and we are going to answer those questions for the last 15 minutes or so of this conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Let me start with a few thoughts about process, because in addition to the transformation of this election, you've also got to take a look at the process of how we vote. In the last three big primaries, Pennsylvania, New York, and Kentucky, first of all, we had primaries postponed from their official date to June 23rd. Secondly, the count is still going on. We don't have final official results in any one of these. We're looking at preliminary results, we're looking at projections, but they're still counting votes. And one of the reasons they're still counting votes is because in all three states and in many states across the country, they have had to deal with a surge in vote by mail, which was something they frankly did not, as election officials, did not anticipate, did not budget, were not prepared for. Now, that's not to say anything negative about vote by mail, because if you notice, Colorado's primary was yesterday. You have unofficial counts from the Secretary of State for all the races in Colorado today, because Colorado, over time, has developed a very effective, foolproof vote-by-mail system. So they knew what they were dealing with. And they counted in the Democratic primary 883,000 mail-in ballots and were able to announce results today. Now, two or three quick thoughts. Number one is this is going to introduce something new to the American November election. It's called patience. If it took from June 23rd to July 1st or June 30th before announcements came out in Kentucky, then if you think about a November 3rd election, it will be a few days after that election before we have real final results. And the American people are going to have to, because of the virus and because there's so many new people dealing with vote by mail, we're not going to have results election night. We're not probably going to have results for a few days afterwards. Two quick questions. Does that mean the system was rigged, or was there fraud, or was there something else? The quick answer to that is no. I've spent the last 10 years working in elections from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. I know what election fraud looks like. We don't have it in the United States. And if you look at the Western states, most of their systems are fairly vote fraud proof. They've got forensics, they've got a whole trail as to voter application, all of that stuff. But the second question is, will this depress turnout? And right now, based on what we're seeing around the country, we have a very excited electorate that wants to have their voices heard. And so you've got thousands of people participating in primaries where they didn't participate before because they want to make their impact with their vote. So I don't think we're going to see a lower turnout. I think we're going to, in fact, be dealing with the other problem, a higher turnout, which is going to challenge election officials around the country if they haven't printed enough provisional ballots, if they haven't been able to purchase the machines to count the paper ballots that are coming in by mail. And the one thing that I would say to all of the audience is, particularly for students who are going to be probably on campus voting absentee from campus, that they ought to check right now after this broadcast what the status is of their registration and what the process is for applying for an absentee ballot and the deadline to return that absentee ballot. And if they're not real confident in their systems, then, or their own memories, I would say go to Rock the Vote or Turbo Vote or vote.org, three great websites and facilities to make sure that people are registered to vote and then follow their own process for absentee ballot application and returning the vote on time. Because the vote on time for the November 3rd election is going to depend on state law. So in New York, if the Postal Service delivered your vote by June 25th, it counted. If it came in the mail the 26th, it didn't count. So people have to pay attention to these deadlines. And this is a very, very important and critical thing, but the systems are now in place that with Rock the Vote, vote.org, or Turbo Vote, you can do it all online. It's all legitimate. It's all in accord with state and county laws concerning the election. So let's go to the question of vote in person versus vote by mail, because that's when the decision to vote and who you're going to vote for takes place. The Kentucky Senate race, Democratic primary for Senate, suggests right now on the data we've seen that McGrath was able to win because she was organized and collected votes by mail, organized vote by mail, well in advance of the primary, completely in accord with Kentucky law. Booker won on vote in person, but then was eclipsed in vote by mail. Now, we're only dealing with 14,000 votes. That's the difference, that's the margin out of almost 500,000 votes cast. Booker had a problem, and this is a problem that people had to anticipate, and that is that 90% of the polling stations in Kentucky were closed. They were closed because of the virus and the push towards vote by mail. That's probably going to continue going into the fall election because of the virus, and frankly, because almost 70%, almost 60% of our election day workers are over 60 years of age. So they're not showing up to do the work for the polling stations. So the question then becomes, when do you decide how you're going to vote in accord, particularly if you're voting by mail? Are you going to be voting sometime in October? Are you going to be voting at the very last minute and hope the Postal Service delivers your vote? Or are you going to be at home and going to perhaps a very different polling location and facing a long line? These are all real questions for this election. Now, let's go to outcome, because I think outcome is what we're most concerned about. I think that progressives are able to put on the table a whole set of new issues to meet the demographics of the voters today. We've got three concentric circles of major challenges to our society. One is simply economic. We are now in a recession, if not depression. The second is the pandemic. And then the third is how we as a society are confronting the issue of race and criminalization of poverty, to use one of Mr. Booker's phrases, police tactics, all of that mix. And all three circles are jumbled together. So there's an opportunity to put something on the table in a meaningful way, which is what progressives are trying to do. And the progressives, particularly in New York State, are looking for a generational shift in their political representation. And at least so far, looking at the June 23rd primary that we don't have decisive final results for yet, it looks like in the three congressional districts, in Nita Lowey's seat, a 33-year-old African-American one out of a field of 8, all 8 of them were heavily credentialed. In Elliot Engel's seat, it looks like Jamal Bowman has won. And then in the Carolyn Maloney seat, we're still in a too close to call. Now, as a director of the Congressional Campaign Committee, oftentimes you see generational and demographic shifts. I mean, pure and simple, the people who elected Elliot Engel 31 years ago and the people who elected Carolyn Maloney 28 years ago, those communities have changed. And they are looking for younger, more dynamic, and more progressive. Although, you know, you look at the voting records of Maloney and Engel and Lowey, they're among the most progressive. So the question is, what is the standard? And the progressives in Kentucky had a chance with Mr. Booker, who really took off in the last month. But why did he take off? Unfortunately, it was the tragedy of a young woman being killed by the police in just a terrible, terrible incident. But then Mr. Booker was also able, I think, to become the candidate of perhaps a racial healing or generational change. There's an interesting newsletter called the Daily Yonder, which looks at what's going on in rural America. And it had a series of articles about how there were Black Lives Matter protests in rural Kentucky that had almost no Black participants because they didn't live there. And how the environment and atmosphere was changing on some of these issues, particularly among millennials. If you look to the Pew Center's latest report on millennial attitudes towards the demonstrations and who was participating and who wasn't, we're seeing a generational shift, which is very, very important. The other piece of the Booker campaign was, as Al Cross, who is one of the great political reporters of Kentucky, said, Booker became the candidate of the fed up. And a lot of Kentuckians were fed up with the status quo, fed up with the lack of a future in their state, fed up with changing industries, fed up with a spectrum of issues that have only been accentuated by the economic and pandemic crises affecting our country right now. So where are we going? Part of this discussion is, where do the Sanders and Warren votes go? Now, depending on which political scientist and survey you want to believe, and this is just rounding out data so we can have a conversation, about 50% of Sanders voters voted for Hillary Clinton in the final analysis. About 10 to 15%, depending on which survey you want to believe, voted for a third-party candidate. About 10 to 15% actually voted for Donald Trump. And about 10 to 25% just didn't vote, dropped out of the system. Now, the question to me is, what can Joe Biden do to attract the other 50% of the Bernie Sanders vote? And I'm sure there's going to be similar data on Elizabeth Warren and a few other candidates. He's got to put something on the table that is meaningful in terms of how he both brings them together as Democrats to defeat Donald Trump, and is defeating Donald Trump alone enough for the progressive agenda. I think the progressive agenda wants something more than just the alternative to Donald Trump or the alternative to Mitch McConnell. I think there's a large agenda out there that is really served up to the American people by the three crises of the economy, the pandemic, and then race relations and the future of race in this country. A country which is changing dramatically and for the better. and with less tolerance towards racial injustice and economic injustice, particularly among millennial voters who were the backbone for both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. The one great point is that the fight did not get as long and as personal as it did in 2016. There was no love lost between the forces of Hillary Clinton and the forces of Bernie Sanders. There's still a portion of people who are dedicated to Senator Sanders and Senator Warren. But because of the personal skills of Joe Biden as a senator and treating every senator with respect from the day he or she walks into that chamber, it's not bitter at the top. It's respectful, it's friendship, it's working together. And that's a very hopeful sign for the leadership portion of it. And now the question is what's going to be on the agenda and motivate those voters to participate. But voters are going to participate in this election. I've never seen voter intensity surveys as high as they are going into this election. And they've been that way for over a year. So this will be a high turnout election, and optimistically a good one for progressives.
So that's a lot to unpack. I mean, there's a lot of information for us to talk about and pick about. Again, we are encouraging people to post their questions in the comment box on our Facebook page. We will get to them over the course of the rest of this conversation. One of the questions I have, though, right from the start, we talked a little bit about process, I think, in the beginning, and you talked a little about the pandemic really is changing the way that we're going to vote in this upcoming election. And you talked a little bit about how the Western states really have it together compared to sort of the Eastern part of the country. What is it that contributed to? Is it because of their far-flung communities? What is it about the Western states that they've got mail-in voting together? They're more prepared for the nature of this election?
There's been a variety of causes behind the Western states to go to all mail in voting. One of it has been natural disasters, where you have floods, where you have other things happen that suddenly threaten the democratic process. Another is the openness of the ballot going back to the progressive era, where in California, you've got, literally hundreds of candidates and hundreds of public policy questions because of referenda and initiative that you have to make a choice on. And so in order to have a better informed voter, California has gone very quickly to vote by mail. So but these systems have been developed over time now. This is not the first time that that the secretaries of state in these regions are going to be dealing with 50 or 60% of the votes being cast by mail. And so it's become part of the civic culture in that part of the country. And frankly, as all of us want to vote online rather than in line, vote by mail is a safe, secure, tested way to vote in the United States. And there are lessons from all of the Western states as to how to detect and prevent any type of fraud or abuse. In North Carolina, in the last presidential election was the only real instance of vote harvesting, where a person was collecting ballots and voting some and not voting others. And that was detected, the election was voided, and the criminal process addressed it.
One of the questions we're getting on the other side of the aisle, we talked a lot about what the Democratic primaries have looked like, but when we talk specifically about vote by mail, at the top of the ticket with the president, there he brings a lot of questions around the legitimacy of vote by mail, and whether or not this will void the election in the fall. Is there potential harm for his side of for the Republican Party in that sort of messaging if states are less inclined to enact, safeguards that allow people to vote safely or vote by mail and make it harder in Republican-held states? Could you see that playing out in the fall?
First of all, let's deal with one fact. Donald Trump has voted by mail for the last 20 years. The idea of Donald Trump voting in person, standing in line someplace, is something that no one can imagine. And he hasn't. and much of his White House staff have voted by mail, because all of these records are available and are public, because there are forensics in place based on lessons learned as to when you apply, when your ballot is received, when you return your ballot, and how you voted. Those statistics are all available through the Election Assistance Commission website, as well as the Secretary of State's of all 50 states. So let's start with that. Secondly, the preference is going to be for people to vote by mail. They do not want to stand in line. There's going to be a fair amount of confusion and congestion around the polling stations that are going to be open. These decisions are all going to be part of the process. But, you know, I don't think, many of the secretaries of state in the West who have developed the vote by mail systems are Republicans. And, you know, you've seen secretaries of state in Ohio and Iowa who are leading Republicans say, you can vote by mail in this state and have absolute confidence. Mm-hmm. So from one perspective, I find it very wrong for the President of the United States to be claiming that the election might not take place. He claimed the last time that it was rigged and he won. So, you know, let's just be guided by facts here and by process and by practice rather than rhetoric.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fair point. I guess it behooves them to really kind of to get to follow the advice of the state governments, I guess, then rather than what they're hearing at the top, at the federal level.
Every American should vote.
Mm-hmm.
I hope we have record turnout. In the past, we've had about a third vote by mail, a third vote early in the process, and a third vote in person on election day. I hope every American votes, and the process is in place to make sure that every ballot is counted and every ballot is accounted for. And Republican, Democratic, Independent, Libertarian, Green, whatever party, whatever flag you're under, the strength of our democracy depends on Americans voting. And I think in this election, Americans are going to vote.
So then to shift from that, or to get to one of the questions that we've gotten on our Facebook page, we talked a little bit about what's fueling the progressive energy. The electorate is changing. The issues at play, the racial justice movements that are happening right now have helped fuel some of these last pushes. Do you think, one of the questions we've got from Richard is, do you think that in the purple or red states, the state's slow or poor administration of unemployment benefits in the face of the pandemic will have an effect on fueling some more progressive energy, particularly in purple states more than red states, where we've seen sort of like people not able to get unemployment benefits for weeks at a time, or Payroll Protection Act programs not being fulfilled. Is that something that you're seeing right now?
We as a country are facing a very basic economic challenge for millions of Americans who need the supplemental unemployment or the payroll protection or the small business loans to survive this economic shutdown. And the Congress of the United States has a huge challenge in July to extend that, or else we're going to see, in my judgment, two huge motivators of very angry, frustrated people. One are people who are going to lose their benefits and lose the income to make the choice between rent or food. But the second is there are so many people now dependent on the benefits who have chosen food over rent that evictions and foreclosures, and where do these people go? And that puts a lot of angry people into the process who are desperate. Voting might not be the only tactic they choose to express their dissatisfaction and their frustration and their lack of hope. And this is a very dangerous time for our society, in my judgment.
With that in mind, you're seeing some of the energy on the progressive side. They're harnessing some of that, the lessons maybe from Booker and from Jamal Bowman in New York. The top of the ticket on both sides of the and the general election is relatively on the older end of the scale in terms of the electorate. Are there lessons that they can take from what they've seen in terms of organizing that they can apply? I mean, specifically, I'm thinking about, are there any lessons that he can apply going forward that would help boost the campaign?
I think the Biden campaign recognizes that what they have to do is both use this time to register new voters, and many of those are in communities that have been underrepresented, or frankly, the community we're talking to of 18 to 25-year-olds who have been a lagging indicator in terms of participation. In my youth, I worked on securing the 18-year-old vote to theoretically help end the war in Vietnam. Well, that didn't work out so well. And youth, the 18 to 25-year-old demographic, has rarely performed according to its proportion of the population. So the challenge to the Biden campaign, as I said earlier, is to put items on the table that motivate those voters to participate. It's got to be more than I'm the alternative to Donald Trump.
And then this probably was, we've touched on this, and this might be a good question to end our half hour on, but you know, as this is from Alan, as on our Facebook page, but as we get closer to the election and there's the worry, you know, things are not going to be legitimate with the election, what kind of messaging would you say the candidates, or particularly Biden, should employ to sort of reassure people that all of the voting that they do, whether in line or on person or online, will be counted?
Well, first of all, we don't have online voting.
Well, I mean, yes, you're right. Mail-in voting. You're right. I'm sorry.
It's frankly not safe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I vote online, I don't know if it's really me who's voting. But secondly, I think I have great confidence that the Biden campaign, excuse me, can put issues on the table and before the American electorate that motivate them to participate. I think Biden's public record is one of openness to new ideas. And it's hard to believe, but Joe Biden was the youngest US senator, and in the 1974-76 election, he was the candidate of the new ideas coming out of the Democrats in the Senate. So he's seen this, he's been there, he's embraced those changes and that generational shift because he's been part of it. And that's really going to be the question going forward. As to the legitimacy of the election, I personally have great faith, having, as I said, worked in elections from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, that the secretaries of state and the local election boards, if given sufficient funding and support, are going to conduct this election according to the highest standards of excellence and honesty and administration that we have set in this country. There's a number of places in public administration in this country where we haven't put our money where our mouth is. Elections is one of them. But so far, in this time of great economic strain of the pandemic, we've seen the election officials been able to conduct the primaries across the country in an honest, constructive fashion to the highest standards of public administration and integrity. We haven't had one instance anywhere where someone's claiming election fraud or election theft. And that standard will continue, I believe, going through November, regardless of what the President of the United States has to say about it.
Sorry, I'm mute. I think we can leave it there, Bill. I appreciate this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this Facebook Live. This is going to be the kickoff of a very interesting election season, and I want to invite you to join us for further Facebook Lives as we move forward. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Bill, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.